let me tell you about Richard the Lionheart, one of the most interesting people who ever lived. His real name was Richard I, and he was the King of England from 1189 to 1199. But he's remembered as much more than just a king. He was a crusader, a warrior, a poet, and a man who spent most of his 10-year reign fighting in distant lands rather than ruling from his throne. Richard earned his nickname Lionheart because of his incredible courage and skill in battle, especially during the Third Crusade in the Holy Land. He was tall, strong, with golden hair and fierce blue eyes that could make enemies tremble. But there's so much more to his story than just the battles and the crown. He was born into one of the most powerful and complicated families in medieval Europe. His father was Henry II of England, and his mother was the legendary Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of her time. Richard grew up in a world of castles and courts, of political schemes and family feuds that would make modern soap operas look simple. What makes Richard truly fascinating is that he lived during a time when the world was changing. The 12th century was an era of crusades and chivalry, of troubadours and courtly love, of great cathedrals being built and new ideas spreading across Europe. Richard was right in the middle of all this excitement and chaos. Tonight, I'm going to take you through his entire life story, from the moment he was born in Oxford in 1157 to his death in France in 1199. We'll see how a third son who wasn't supposed to become king ended up wearing the crown of England. We'll follow him through his childhood in the courts of France and England, his teenage years learning to be a warrior and a ruler, and his adult life filled with battles, political intrigue, and the great adventure of the Crusades. You'll learn about his complicated relationships with his parents and brothers, his marriage to a Spanish princess he barely knew, and his friendships with everyone from fellow kings to common soldiers. We'll explore his victories and his failures, his moments of great heroism, and his times of doubt and struggle. By the end of his story, you'll understand why Richard the Lionheart has captured people's imaginations for over 800 years, inspiring countless books, movies, and legends that are still told today. On September 8th of 157, in the Grand Beaumont Palace in Oxford, England, a baby's cry pierced the air, announcing the birth of a prince who would one day shake the medieval world. The world Richard entered was vastly different from ours. England in 1157 was a land of stone castles and wooden villages where most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, and where being born into royalty meant a life of unimaginable privilege, but also incredible responsibility. His father, Henry II, was 24 years old and already King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou. Henry was a stocky, energetic man with reddish hair and a terrible temper that could explode without warning. He was always moving, always planning, always thinking about the next castle to build or the next territory to claim. People said Henry never sat still except when he was asleep, and sometimes not even then. He spoke several languages fluently and could read and write at a time when many nobles couldn't even sign their own names. Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was around 35 when he was born, which was considered quite mature for childbearing in those days. Eleanor was absolutely extraordinary. Imagine a woman who had been Queen of France, then divorced the French king to marry the English one, all while controlling vast territories in her own right. She was stunningly beautiful, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, but her beauty was just the beginning. Eleanor was educated, witty, and powerful in ways that most women of her time could never dream of being. She wrote poetry, sponsored troubadours, and had opinions about politics that she wasn't afraid to share. The palace where Richard was born was a magnificent stone structure with high walls, narrow windows, and great halls where hundreds of people could gather for feasts. The floors were covered with rushes that were changed regularly to keep away the smells, and tapestries hung on the walls to keep out the cold and dampness. Candles and oil lamps provided light, filling the air with the scent of burning wax and oil. In winter, enormous fireplaces roared with logs the size of tree trunks, but even so, the stone walls stayed cold to the touch. The Plantagenet family was wealthy beyond imagination, but that wealth came with complications. Henry II controlled an empire that stretched from the Scottish border down to the Pyrenees Mountains, but holding on to all that territory meant constant travel, constant warfare, and constant political maneuvering. Money poured in from taxes, rents, and trade, but it poured out just as quickly to pay for armies, castles, and the enormous household that traveled with the royal family wherever they went. Richard was the third son born to Henry and Eleanor, which meant he wasn't expected to inherit the throne of England. His older brother Henry was the heir apparent, already being groomed to be the next king. His brother Geoffrey was destined to rule Brittany. But Richard would get something special too. He was destined for Aquitaine, his mother's vast duchy in southwestern France, a land of vineyards and warm sunshine, troubadours and courtly culture. Richard had other siblings too. His older sister Matilda was already making political marriages to strengthen family alliances. Later would come his younger brother John, who would play such an important role in Richard's later life, and his sister Joan, who would become Queen of Sicily. The Plantagenet children were scattered across Europe, each being raised to rule different parts of the family empire. As a baby, Richard was cared for by wet nurses, as was customary for royal children. His mother, Eleanor, despite her deep love for her children, was far too busy with political affairs to spend her days nursing babies. The wet nurses were carefully chosen women, usually the wives of minor nobles, who lived in the palace and devoted themselves entirely to the care of the royal infant. They sang to him, rocked him to sleep, and told him the first stories he ever heard. Richard's first years were spent in a whirlwind of travel. The royal court never stayed in one place for long. 1 month might find them in a castle in Normandy, the next in a palace in Anjou, then off to Winchester or London. The royal household consisted of hundreds of people, knights, servants, clerks, cooks, grooms, guards, and hangers-on who traveled in a great procession from place to place. Imagine dozens of wagons loaded with furniture, clothes, documents, food, and treasure, all protected by armed knights on horseback. The food little Richard ate was rich and varied compared to what common people had. There was meat almost every day: beef, pork, lamb, chicken, and game like venison and wild boar. There were fresh fish from rivers and ponds, and exotic spices brought by merchants from far-off lands. Bread was made from fine white flour, not the coarse brown bread that peasants ate. There were eggs, cheese, butter, and in season, fresh fruits like apples, pears, and grapes. Wine flowed freely at every meal, even watered down for the children. Richard's clothes were made from the finest materials available: silk from the East, wool from England, linen from Flanders, all dyed in rich colors that only the wealthy could afford. His baby clothes were trimmed with ermine and decorated with gold thread. Even as a toddler, he wore tiny versions of adult noble clothing, tunics, hose, and soft leather shoes that were replaced as soon as he outgrew them. The castles and palaces where Richard spent his early childhood were fascinating places for a curious little boy. There were great halls with soaring ceilings, winding staircases and stone towers, secret passages behind walls, and courtyards bustling with activity. In the kitchens, enormous fireplaces roasted whole animals, and servants bustled about preparing meals for hundreds of people. The stables housed the finest horses in Europe, and the armories displayed weapons and armor that gleamed in the torchlight. Richard's personality began to show early. Nurses and servants later remembered him as a beautiful, active child with his father's energy and his mother's intelligence. He had golden hair that caught the light and blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He was tall for his age, strong, and fearless in a way that sometimes worried his caretakers. Even as a small child, he showed the physical courage that would later make him famous. His first words were likely in French, the language of the Norman nobility, though he would have heard English, Latin, and the languages of Aquitaine spoken around him daily. The royal court was incredibly cosmopolitan, with people from all over the Plantagenet Empire coming and going constantly. Richard grew up hearing different languages, different accents, and different ways of thinking about the world. The extended family that surrounded Richard was enormous and complicated. His paternal grandfather, Geoffrey of Anjou, had died before Richard was born, but stories about him filled the family legends. His maternal grandfather, William of Aquitaine, had been a patron of troubadours and a lover of poetry and music. Eleanor's court had been famous throughout Europe as a center of culture and learning, and she brought that tradition with her to England. There were aunts and uncles scattered across Europe, each ruling their own territories, making their own alliances and occasionally feuding with other family members. Cousins appeared and disappeared as political situations changed. The network of relationships was so complex that keeping track of who was allied with whom required constant attention. Christmas celebrations in Richard's childhood were spectacular affairs. The great halls would be decorated with evergreen boughs, and enormous feasts would last for days. Minstrels and troubadours would perform songs and tell stories that lasted far into the night. Gifts were exchanged, though not in the way we think of Christmas gifts today. Instead, nobles would give each other valuable objects, jeweled cups, fine weapons, exotic furs, or beautiful horses. The religious life of the royal family was intense and ever-present. The day began with prayers, continued with religious observances throughout the day, and ended with evening prayers. Richard learned his letters partly through religious texts, and the stories he heard included many tales of saints, martyrs, and religious heroes. The idea of crusade, of holy war to defend Christianity, was part of the air he breathed from his earliest childhood. As Richard grew from a baby to a toddler, his world expanded beyond the nursery. He began to explore the castles and palaces where his family lived, always under the watchful eyes of servants and guards. He learned to walk on stone floors that were cold even in summer, to climb stairs that were built for adult legs, and to navigate the complex social world of the medieval court, where everyone had their proper place and their proper role. When Richard turned 7 years old in 1164, his childhood of protected nursery life came to an abrupt end. In medieval noble families, 7 was considered the age when boys began their real education, and for a future duke, that education was both comprehensive and demanding. His formal schooling began not in England but in France, in the sophisticated courts of his mother's territories. Richard's first day of serious lessons took place in a stone chamber high in a castle tower, with narrow windows that let in long shafts of morning sunlight. The room was furnished with wooden benches, writing tables, and shelves lined with precious books, still rare and valuable objects that were chained to prevent theft. His tutor was a learned clerk named Peter of Bly, a man with a sharp mind and little patience for lazy students. The curriculum for a future ruler was unlike anything a modern child would recognize. Richard's mornings began before dawn with prayers, followed by lessons in Latin grammar and literature. Latin was the language of the church, of law, of diplomacy, and of educated discourse throughout Europe. Richard had to master not just speaking and understanding Latin, but reading and writing it fluently. He studied the great Roman authors, Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, not just for their language, but for the lessons they taught about leadership, war, and human nature. Mathematics came next, though medieval mathematics was quite different from what we know today. Richard learned to calculate using Roman numerals. To understand the complex systems of weights and measures used in different parts of his future realm, and to grasp the basics of geometry that would be essential for understanding castle construction and military engineering. The abacus was his calculator, and he became skilled at manipulating the beads to solve complex problems. His favorite subject was history, particularly the stories of great warriors and kings. He learned about Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Charlemagne, and the heroes of the Song of Roland. These weren't dry academic exercises, they were instruction manuals for kingship filled with examples of how great leaders inspired their followers, won battles, and built lasting kingdoms. Richard would listen with intense concentration as his tutors described famous battles, brilliant strategies, and acts of heroic courage. Geography was taught through maps that showed the known world from the British Isles to the Holy Land. Richard studied the territories he would one day rule, learning about their resources, their people, their strategic importance, and their vulnerabilities. He memorized the locations of major cities, rivers, mountain passes, and castles. This knowledge would prove invaluable when he later led armies across Europe during the Crusades. The afternoons brought different kinds of learning. Physical training was as important as book learning for a future military leader. Richard began learning swordplay with wooden practice weapons, starting with basic stances and movements. His instructors were veteran knights who had fought in real battles, men with scars and missing fingers, who could teach not just technique, but the harsh realities of combat. Riding lessons were equally crucial. Richard learned not just to stay on a horse, but to control a powerful war horse with his knees while wielding weapons with both hands. Medieval warfare was dominated by heavy cavalry, and a knight who couldn't ride superbly was a dead knight. Richard showed natural talent, developing the excellent horsemanship that would later make him such an effective military commander. His relationship with his teachers was complex. Some he respected and learned from eagerly, others he clashed with, showing the hot temper he had inherited from his father. One tutor, frustrated by Richard's tendency to argue about military tactics, complained in a letter that the young prince thinks he knows more about war than men who have spent their lives fighting. But even critical teachers admitted that Richard was brilliant, curious, and determined to excel. Richard's fellow students were other young nobles, sons of important families, who were being educated alongside the royal children. These boys would later become his allies, his rivals, and his supporters. The friendships and enmities formed in these school years would shape the politics of his adult life. Among his companions was William Marshall, who would become one of the greatest knights of the age and one of Richard's most trusted advisors. The school day was long and demanding. It began at dawn with prayers and ended after evening prayers, with breaks only for meals and brief periods of physical exercise. The boys slept in dormitories, long stone rooms with rows of narrow beds. Even princes didn't have private rooms during their school years. The idea was to build character through shared hardship and mutual dependence. Discipline was strict and often harsh. Boys who failed to pay attention, who spoke out of turn, or who showed disrespect to their teachers could expect to be beaten with wooden rods. Richard received his share of these punishments, though he bore them with the stoic pride that was expected of future leaders. Years later, he would say that these beatings taught him valuable lessons about enduring pain and maintaining dignity under pressure. The food in the school was simpler than what Richard had been accustomed to in the royal palaces. Breakfast was bread and weak ale or wine mixed with water. Dinner, the main meal of the day, might include meat, but it was often tough and stringy compared to the fine cuisine of the royal kitchens. Supper was usually bread, cheese, and ale. The boys were always hungry, and food became a constant preoccupation. As Richard entered his teenage years, his education became more specialized and more intense. At 13, he was considered old enough to begin learning the real arts of war and statecraft. This meant spending time in the field with experienced military commanders, observing how armies were organized, how battles were planned, and how soldiers were motivated. His first real taste of military life came when he accompanied his father on a campaign in Wales in 1171. Richard was 14, tall for his age, with the golden hair and intense blue eyes that would later make him instantly recognizable on battlefields. The Welsh campaign was brutal and exhausting, involving long marches through difficult terrain, attacks on heavily fortified positions, and the constant threat of ambush. Richard loved every minute of it. While other young nobles complained about the hardships, Richard thrived on the challenge. He watched everything, asked endless questions, and began to develop his own ideas about military strategy and tactics. His father's commanders noticed his intense interest and began to include him in their planning sessions. The relationship between Richard and his father during these years was complicated and often tense. Henry II was proud of his son's abilities, but worried about his independence and his tendency to question authority. Richard, like many teenagers, was impatient with his father's caution and eager to prove himself. The two often argued about strategy, about politics, and about Richard's future role in the family empire. Richard's relationship with his mother Eleanor was much warmer, though they were often separated by the demands of politics. Eleanor recognized in Richard a kindred spirit, someone who shared her love of culture, her political intelligence, and her strong will. When they were together, usually during major court celebrations, Eleanor would share with Richard her knowledge of poetry, music, and the sophisticated culture of Aquitaine. The court culture that Richard absorbed during his teenage years was unlike anything that existed elsewhere in Europe. Eleanor's court was famous for its patronage of troubadours, its celebration of courtly love, and its sophisticated literary culture. Richard learned to appreciate poetry, music, and the arts of conversation that would later make him popular in the courts of Europe. He even tried his hand at writing verse, composing poems in the Languedoc, the language of southern France. But it wasn't all culture and refinement. Richard's teenage years were also marked by the violent family conflicts that plagued the Plantagenet dynasty. In 1173, when Richard was 16, he joined his older brothers Henry and Geoffrey in a great rebellion against their father. This wasn't a teenage tantrum, it was a serious military campaign that divided the Plantagenet Empire and brought French armies into England. The rebellion began over questions of inheritance and authority. Richard's older brother Henry had been crowned as heir apparent, but had been given no real power. Richard himself had been invested as Duke of Aquitaine, but found his authority constantly challenged by his father's representatives. The young princes felt that their father was keeping them powerless while continuing to make all the important decisions himself. Eleanor supported her sons in the rebellion, which added another layer of complexity to the family drama. The rebellion lasted for over a year and involved battles across France and England. Richard proved himself in combat for the first time, leading charges of heavy cavalry and showing the personal courage that would later make him legendary. The rebellion ultimately failed, but it established Richard as a formidable military leader and a political force in his own right. His father forgave him, as was customary after such family conflicts, but their relationship was never quite the same. Richard had tasted independence and found that he liked it. During the later years of his teens, Richard began to take more control of Aquitaine, the duchy that would be his primary responsibility. This meant spending more time in France, learning to navigate the complex politics of the region, and dealing with the constant rebellions and conflicts that plagued the area. Aquitaine was difficult to govern. It was wealthy and culturally sophisticated, but its nobles were independent-minded and quick to rebel against authority they didn't respect. Richard's approach to governing Aquitaine showed both his strengths and his weaknesses as a future ruler. He was decisive, courageous, and willing to take personal risks to maintain his authority, but he was also quick-tempered, sometimes cruel to defeated enemies, and impatient with the slow processes of negotiation and compromise that effective government required. His teenage years also saw the beginning of his interest in the Crusades. The news of Saladin's victories in the Holy Land and the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 reached Europe when Richard was 30, but the idea of crusading had been part of his education from childhood. The stories of the First Crusade, the establishment of the Crusader states, and the ongoing struggle between Christianity and Islam were constant themes in the literature and conversation of his youth. Richard's formal education officially ended when he was 18, but in many ways, his real education was just beginning. He had mastered the basics of leadership, warfare, and statecraft, but he would spend the rest of his life learning how to apply those lessons in the real world of medieval politics and warfare. When Richard turned 18 in 1125, he officially became Duke of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and wealthy duchies in Western Europe. This wasn't just a ceremonial title, it meant taking real control of territories that stretched from the Loire River in the north to the Pyrenees Mountains in the south, lands that included some of the richest vineyards, busiest trade routes, and most cultured cities in medieval Europe. His first challenge as a duke was establishing his authority over nobles, who had grown accustomed to acting independently during the years when Aquitaine had been governed by his father's representatives. The southern French nobility were proud, independent, and quick to test any new ruler. They spoke a different language. Occitan, rather than French, had different customs and had little natural loyalty to a young prince from England. Richard's first major test came with a rebellion led by Geoffrey of Rancon, a powerful baron who controlled several important castles in the region. Geoffrey had decided that an 18-year-old duke would be easy to manipulate or ignore. He was wrong. Richard gathered an army with surprising speed and efficiency, demonstrating the organizational skills he had learned during his years of education and training. The siege of Geoffrey's castle at Pons became Richard's first real command as a military leader. For 3 weeks, Richard's forces surrounded the fortress, using catapults to bombard the walls and attempting to tunnel underneath the foundations. Richard was everywhere, inspecting the siege engines, encouraging his soldiers, and personally leading dangerous reconnaissance missions to study the castle's defenses. The siege was successful, but it was Richard's treatment of the defeated rebels that really established his reputation. Instead of executing Geoffrey of Rancon as many expected, Richard pardoned him and invited him to join his court. This combination of military effectiveness and political wisdom impressed the nobles of Aquitaine and helped establish Richard's authority throughout the duchy. Richard's daily routine as Duke of Aquitaine was exhausting and varied. He would rise before dawn, attend morning prayers, and then spend hours reviewing reports from his various administrators and military commanders. The duchy was enormous, and keeping track of everything that was happening required constant attention to detail. Letters arrived daily from castellans reporting on the state of fortifications, from tax collectors reporting on revenue, and from merchants requesting protection for their trade routes. His court was constantly on the move. Medieval rulers governed by traveling from place to place, holding court in different castles and cities, ensuring that their presence was felt throughout their territories. Richard's household included dozens of knights, clerks, servants, and hangers-on who formed a traveling community that could set up and tear down their temporary capital wherever the duke happened to be. The financial aspects of ruling Aquitaine were complex and demanding. The duchy's wealth came from multiple sources: taxes on trade, rents from ducal lands, fees from the administration of justice, and payments from vassals who held their lands in exchange for military service. Richard had to understand all of these revenue streams and make sure that money was flowing in sufficient quantities to support his court, his military forces, and his political ambitions. Richard's approach to justice was hands-on and often dramatic. He held regular court sessions where people could bring their disputes for ducal judgment. These sessions were theater as much as legal proceedings. Richard would sit on a throne-like chair, surrounded by his advisors and knights, while petitioners and accused criminals were brought before him. His judgments were usually swift and decisive, though not always popular. One case that became famous throughout Aquitaine involved a merchant who had been robbed by a local lord. The lord claimed that the merchant had been traveling without proper safe conduct and was therefore fair game. Richard listened to both sides, then announced his judgment. The lord would repay the merchant double what had been stolen and would spend a month in Richard's dungeon to consider the importance of protecting trade. The merchant became one of Richard's most loyal supporters, and the lord never troubled travelers again. Richard's personal life during these years was complicated by the political realities of medieval marriage. As a duke and potential king, his marriage would be a matter of international diplomacy rather than personal choice. Various alliances were proposed and abandoned as political situations changed. At different times, he was engaged to daughters of the kings of France, Navarre, and Castile, though none of these engagements led to immediate marriage. His relationships with women during this period were the subject of much court gossip and speculation. Medieval chroniclers were often vague about such matters, but it's clear that Richard had romantic relationships with several women, including at least one relationship that produced a child. The demands of his position, however, meant that personal relationships always took second place to political necessities. Richard's friendship with other young nobles of his generation was an important part of his early adult life. These men would later become his most trusted advisors and military commanders. William Marshall, who had been educated alongside Richard, became not just a friend, but a mentor in the arts of knighthood and chivalry. Philip of Cognac, Richard's half-brother, became one of his most trusted military commanders. The cultural life of Richard's court was as important as its political and military functions. Following his mother Eleanor's example, Richard patronized troubadours, poets, and musicians. His court became known throughout Europe as a center of culture and learning. Richard himself was accomplished in music and poetry, and he took genuine pleasure in the artistic achievements of his court. One of the most famous incidents from this period involved a contest between troubadours. At Richard's court, two poets had composed competing songs about courtly love, each claiming that his version was superior. Richard listened to both performances, then announced that he would compose a third song that would surpass both of theirs. The song he composed that evening became famous throughout Europe and was still being sung centuries later. Richard's military reputation continued to grow during these years through a series of successful campaigns against rebellious nobles and external enemies. His tactics were innovative and effective. He combined the heavy cavalry charges favored by northern European knights with the more flexible tactics he had learned from his experiences in the south. He was also an early adopter of new military technologies, including improved siege engines and better armor. One campaign that particularly enhanced Richard's reputation was his successful defense of the strategic city of La Rochelle against a combined French and rebel attack in 1110. The siege lasted for 2 months, during which Richard demonstrated not just military skill, but also the ability to inspire loyalty in his followers. His soldiers, according to contemporary accounts, would follow him anywhere because they knew he would never ask them to face dangers he wouldn't face himself. Richard's relationship with his father, Henry II, during these years was complex and often strained. Henry was proud of Richard's successes, but worried about his independence and his tendency to make decisions without consulting the royal court. The two men were very similar in many ways. Both were energetic, decisive, and impatient with obstacles, which meant they often clashed over questions of authority and policy. The financial pressures of maintaining his position as Duke were enormous. Richard's court, his military forces, and his political activities required constant funding. He became expert at raising money through various means, some legitimate, some questionable. He imposed new taxes, sold governmental positions, and even auctioned off pardons for various crimes. These practices made him unpopular with some of his subjects, but provided the resources he needed to maintain his power. Richard's interest in the Crusades began to intensify during this period. as news arrived of the deteriorating situation in the Holy Land. The Second Crusade had ended in failure decades earlier, and the Crusader states established by the First Crusade were under increasing pressure from Muslim forces. Richard began to see participation in a new crusade not just as a religious duty, but as an opportunity to enhance his reputation and demonstrate his leadership on the greatest stage medieval Europe could offer. His preparation for what would eventually become the Third Crusade began years before he actually took the cross. He studied the geography of the Holy Land, gathered information about Muslim military tactics, and began building the financial resources that would be necessary for such an enormous undertaking. He also began cultivating relationships with other European rulers who might participate in a new crusade. The death of his older brother Henry in 1183 changed everything for Richard. Suddenly, instead of being a duke who might someday inherit a crown, he was the direct heir to the throne of England and to his father's entire empire. This new position brought new responsibilities, but also new opportunities. Richard began to spend more time in England, learning about the kingdom he would someday rule and building relationships with the English nobility. But the transition wasn't smooth. Richard's younger brother John had expected to inherit more territory and power, and the disappointment created tensions that would plague the family for years to come. Richard also had to navigate the complex relationships between his various titles and territories. As Duke of Aquitaine, he owed feudal allegiance to the King of France, but as heir to the English throne, he would someday be that king's rival for power in Europe. The moment that would define Richard's entire legacy came on July 4th, 187, when devastating news reached the courts of Europe. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin, the great Muslim leader, who had united the Islamic world against the Crusader states. The news hit Christian Europe like a thunderbolt. The Holy City, captured by the First Crusade nearly a century earlier, was once again in Muslim hands. Churches across Europe rang their bells in mourning, and calls for a new crusade echoed from every pulpit. For Richard, now 30 years old, and at the height of his powers as Duke of Aquitaine, this news represented the opportunity he had been preparing for his entire adult life. Here was a cause that would allow him to demonstrate his military genius, his devotion to Christianity, and his leadership abilities on the greatest stage medieval Europe could offer. The Third Crusade would make his reputation and earn him the nickname that would echo through history. The process of organizing the Third Crusade was monumentally complex. This wasn't just a matter of gathering an army and marching to the Holy Land. It required diplomacy, logistics, and financial resources on a scale that medieval Europe had rarely attempted. 3 of the most powerful rulers in Europe would lead this crusade: Richard himself, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Richard's preparation for the crusade demonstrated his organizational abilities and his understanding of what such an enormous undertaking would require. He began by taking the cross, formally vowing to participate in the crusade in a ceremony at the Cathedral of Tours in one. The ceremony was deeply moving, with Richard kneeling before the altar while the archbishop placed the crusader's cross on his shoulder, marking him as a soldier of Christ. But taking the cross was just the beginning. Richard understood that the crusade would require vast amounts of money, and he set about raising funds with characteristic energy and ruthlessness. He imposed a special tax called the Saladin tithe on all his subjects, taking 1/10 of their income to fund the Holy War. He sold governmental positions, pardons, and even entire towns to raise additional funds. According to one contemporary chronicler, Richard declared that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. The scale of these fundraising efforts was unprecedented. Richard raised what would be equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. Every piece of silver plate in his treasuries was melted down for coins, Every valuable possession that wasn't absolutely necessary for the crusade was sold. The royal jewels, ceremonial weapons, even his father's crown were turned into cash to fund the expedition. While Richard was organizing his forces, dramatic political changes were reshaping his world. His father, Henry II, died in 1189, making Richard not just Duke of Aquitaine, but King of England. The coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on September 3, 1189, in a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence. Richard wore robes of gold and purple, carried a scepter encrusted with precious stones, and was crowned with a golden circlet that caught the light streaming through the abbey's windows. But Richard's mind was already focused on the crusade. He spent only 4 months in England after his coronation, just long enough to organize the kingdom's government and raise additional funds for his expedition. He appointed capable administrators to rule in his absence and made arrangements for the defense of his territories. Then, in December 1189, he set out for the Holy Land. The journey to the Holy Land was itself an epic adventure. Richard chose to travel by sea, which was faster than the overland route but fraught with its own dangers. His fleet consisted of more than 200 ships carrying nearly 8,000 men, along with horses, weapons, supplies, and siege engines. The logistics of moving such a force across the Mediterranean required careful planning and enormous expense. The fleet made several stops along the way, and at each stop, Richard's reputation grew. In Sicily, he became involved in local politics, supporting his sister Joan, who was Queen of Sicily, in a dispute over her late husband's inheritance. Richard's intervention was characteristically decisive. He captured the city of Messina in a single day, demonstrating the military efficiency that would later make him famous in the Holy Land. The conquest of Messina became legendary throughout Europe. Richard had given the defenders of the city an ultimatum: surrender immediately or face the consequences. When they refused, Richard personally led the assault, scaling the walls and fighting hand-to-hand with the defenders. By evening, the city was his, and the Sicilian nobles who had been defying his sister were begging for mercy. But it was Richard's performance during the siege of Acre that truly established his reputation as the greatest military leader of his generation. Acre was a crucial port city that had been under siege by Christian forces for nearly 2 years. When Richard arrived in June 11, the siege had become a stalemate, with neither side able to achieve victory. Richard's arrival changed everything. Richard brought to the siege not just additional troops, but new energy, new tactics, and new siege engines that he had designed specifically for the campaign. His engineers constructed enormous catapults that could hurl stones weighing several hundred pounds at the city's walls. His miners dug tunnels under the fortifications, while his archers provided covering fire for assault troops. But more than his technical innovations, it was Richard's personal leadership that made the difference. He was everywhere during the siege, inspecting the siege lines at dawn, encouraging his troops during the day, and planning the next day's attacks far into the night. When he fell ill with fever, as many crusaders did in the heat and disease-ridden conditions of the siege, he had himself carried to the front lines on a stretcher so he could continue directing operations. The fall of Acre on July 12, 1191, was Richard's first great triumph of the crusade. The city that had resisted the combined Christian armies for 2 years surrendered within weeks of Richard's arrival. The victory celebrations lasted for days, with Te Deum sung in the captured mosques, which were immediately converted to churches, and victory banquets that featured the finest foods and wines that could be brought from Europe. But Richard's treatment of the Muslim prisoners taken at Acre revealed the darker side of his character. When negotiations over prisoner exchanges broke down, Richard ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim captives. The massacre was carried out in full view of Saladin's army, who watched helplessly from across the plain. This act of calculated cruelty enhanced Richard's reputation for ruthlessness while demonstrating his determination to achieve his objectives regardless of the cost. The march from Acre to Jaffa became one of the most famous military movements in medieval history. Richard had to move his army along the coast while under constant attack from Saladin's forces, who used hit-and-run tactics to try to wear down the Christian army. The heat was terrible, water was scarce, and the soldiers were exhausted by months of siege warfare. Richard's solution was to reorganize his entire army into a fighting formation that could move and fight simultaneously. He placed his heavy cavalry in the center, protected by infantry armed with crossbows and spears. Supply wagons moved along the coast under protection of the fleet, while light cavalry scouted ahead and protected the flanks. It was a masterpiece of military organization that allowed him to cover the distance to Jaffa while maintaining the combat effectiveness of his forces. The Battle of Arsuf, on September 791, was Richard's greatest military victory and the moment that earned him the nickname Lionheart. Saladin had gathered his entire army to destroy the Christian force, and for most of the day, it appeared that he might succeed. Wave after wave of Muslim cavalry charged the Christian lines, while archers poured arrows into the ranks of crusaders. Richard held his forces back for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to launch his counterattack. When it came, the charge of Richard's heavy cavalry was devastating. Richard himself led the charge, his sword flashing in the sunlight as he cut through the enemy ranks. Contemporary accounts describe how Richard seemed to be everywhere at once, rallying his troops, striking down enemies, and turning potential defeat into overwhelming victory. The victory at Arsuf made Richard's reputation throughout both the Christian and Muslim worlds. Saladin himself, according to Muslim chroniclers, spoke with admiration of Richard's courage and military skill. The battle also demonstrated Richard's ability to inspire his followers. Soldiers who had been on the verge of panic were transformed into an irresistible fighting force by their king's example. But despite his military successes, Richard was unable to achieve his ultimate goal of recapturing Jerusalem. The city was too well defended, his army was weakened by disease and casualties, and political complications back in Europe were demanding his attention. After months of negotiations, Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce that allowed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem while leaving the city in Muslim hands. The decision to accept the truce, rather than assault Jerusalem, was one of the most difficult of Richard's life. He had come to the Holy Land to recapture the Holy City, and returning to Europe without achieving that goal felt like failure. But Richard was also a practical leader who understood that his weakened army was unlikely to succeed in a direct assault on Jerusalem's formidable defenses. Richard's departure from the Holy Land in October 1192 marked the end of his active participation in the Third Crusade, but his reputation as a military leader had been established forever. Stories of his exploits spread throughout Europe, growing more legendary with each telling. Troubadours composed songs about his victories. Chroniclers wrote detailed accounts of his campaigns, and his name became synonymous with military genius and personal courage. The financial cost of the crusade had been enormous, but the political and personal benefits were equally significant. Richard had demonstrated his leadership abilities on the grandest possible stage and had earned the respect of friends and enemies alike. He had also established relationships with rulers throughout Europe and the Mediterranean that would serve him well in the political struggles that lay ahead. Behind the legend of the warrior king was a complex man whose personal relationships were shaped by the demands of medieval politics, the expectations of royal duty, and his own complicated personality. Richard's personal life was never entirely his own. Every friendship, every romantic relationship, every family connection was viewed through the lens of political advantage and dynastic necessity. Richard's marriage to Berengaria of Navarre in 1191 was a perfect example of how personal relationships and political strategy intertwined in medieval royal life. The marriage was arranged not for love, but to secure an alliance with the Kingdom of Navarre, whose strategic location in the Pyrenees would help protect Richard's southern French territories. Berengaria was the daughter of King Sancho II of Navarre, a woman described by contemporary chroniclers as intelligent, pious, and reasonably attractive, though not the legendary beauty that political marriages sometimes produced. The wedding ceremony itself took place in a chapel in Cyprus during Richard's journey to the Holy Land, a rushed affair that demonstrated Richard's priorities. He was eager to secure the political alliance, but unwilling to delay his crusade for an elaborate celebration. Berengaria wore a simple white gown, and Richard appeared in his traveling clothes rather than royal regalia. The ceremony was witnessed by a handful of knights and clergy, a far cry from the magnificent royal weddings that usually marked such important political alliances. Their relationship was cordial but distant. Berengaria accompanied Richard to the Holy Land, one of the few queens to participate directly in the Crusades, but their time together was limited by the demands of military campaigns. Richard was constantly busy with siege preparations, battle planning, and negotiations with other crusade leaders. Berengaria established her own household within the crusade camp, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting and chaplains who had traveled with her from Navarre. The couple had no children, a fact that became a source of constant concern for Richard's advisors and subjects. In medieval Europe, the primary purpose of royal marriage was to produce heirs, and a childless marriage was viewed as both a personal tragedy and a political disaster. Various explanations were offered by contemporary chroniclers. Some blamed the stress of constant warfare, others suggested that God was punishing Richard for some unspecified sin, and still others whispered about more personal failings. Richard's relationship with his mother Eleanor remained one of the most important connections in his life throughout his adult years. Eleanor, now in her 70s, but still politically active, served as Richard's most trusted advisor and regent during his absence on crusade. Their correspondence, fragments of which survive in various archives, reveals a deep mutual respect and affection that transcended the usual formalities of royal communication. Eleanor's letters to Richard during the crusade mixed motherly concern with shrewd political advice. She would write about his health, urging him to be careful in battle and to avoid the diseases that were killing so many crusaders, but in the same letter she would provide detailed intelligence about political developments in England and France. She understood better than anyone how Richard's mind worked and how to present information in ways that would influence his decisions. Their relationship was complicated by Eleanor's own remarkable history. As the former Queen of France and current Queen Mother of England, Eleanor had her own political relationships and obligations that sometimes conflicted with Richard's interests. But throughout Richard's reign, she remained his most loyal supporter and most effective representative in European politics. Richard's relationships with his brothers were more complicated and often tense. His younger brother John, who would later become King of England himself, was particularly problematic. John was intelligent and charming, but also unreliable and ambitious. While Richard was away on crusade, John made several attempts to seize power in England, creating constant political crises that demanded Eleanor's attention and undermined Richard's authority. The relationship between Richard and John was marked by a mixture of family affection and political suspicion. Richard loved his brother and wanted to trust him, but John's repeated betrayals made that impossible. Contemporary chroniclers described emotional confrontations between the two brothers, with Richard ultimately forgiving John's rebellions and threatening him with exile or imprisonment. Richard's relationship with his deceased older brother Henry had been equally complex. Before Henry's death in 1183, the two brothers had been rivals for their father's favor and for control of different parts of the Plantagenet Empire. But they had also been companions in rebellion against their father, and Richard genuinely mourned Henry's death, even as it cleared his path to the English throne. The friendships Richard formed with other military leaders were among the most important relationships of his life. William Marshal, who had been Richard's companion since childhood, became his most trusted military advisor and one of his closest friends. Marshall was everything a medieval knight was supposed to be: brave, loyal, skilled with weapons, and absolutely reliable in both war and peace. Their friendship was tested by the demands of constant warfare and political intrigue, but it never broke. Marshall was one of the few people who could speak honestly to Richard about his mistakes and shortcomings without fear of royal anger. When Richard was planning particularly dangerous military operations, Marshall was often the voice of caution, urging his king to consider the risks more carefully. Another crucial friendship was with Hubert Walter, who served as Richard's Archbishop of Canterbury and chief administrator in England. Walter was a brilliant organizer who managed to keep England functioning during Richard's long absences. His letters to Richard reveal a relationship that combined deep respect with genuine affection, though Walter sometimes expressed frustration with Richard's tendency to make decisions without considering their administrative consequences. Richard's relationships with the common soldiers who served under him were unusual for a medieval king. Most rulers maintained strict social distance from their troops, but Richard had a gift for inspiring personal loyalty among ordinary soldiers. He would walk through the camp before battles, talking with individual soldiers, asking about their families, and sharing jokes that would spread throughout the army. Contemporary accounts describe how Richard would sometimes join his soldiers around their campfires in the evening, listening to their songs and stories, and even contributing his own compositions. These informal moments helped create the intense loyalty that made Richard's armies so effective in battle. Soldiers would follow him into situations that seemed hopeless because they trusted his leadership and felt that he genuinely cared about their welfare. Richard's court was a fascinating mixture of warriors, scholars, artists, and hangers-on who created a unique cultural environment. The king attracted troubadours and poets from across Europe, and his court became famous for its patronage of music and literature. Richard himself was accomplished in both arts, composing songs that were performed throughout Europe and writing poetry that survives to this day. One of the most famous poems attributed to Richard was written during his captivity in Austria after his return from the Crusade. The poem, written in the Languedoc of southern France, expressed his frustration with his imprisonment and his anger at the political machinations that had landed him in an Austrian dungeon. The poem became famous throughout Europe and helped maintain Richard's reputation even during his darkest period. Richard's religious life was complex and sometimes contradictory. He was genuinely pious by medieval standards, attending daily mass, observing the fasts and festivals of the church calendar, and making generous donations to religious institutions. His participation in the crusade was motivated at least partly by sincere religious conviction, and he took seriously his role as a defender of Christianity. But Richard's religious convictions were balanced by political pragmatism. He was willing to negotiate with Muslim leaders when it served his purposes, and he showed respect for Islamic culture and learning that was unusual among crusaders. His correspondence with Saladin, conducted through interpreters and diplomatic intermediaries, reveals a mutual respect that transcended religious differences. Richard's daily routine, when he wasn't actively campaigning, reflected the complex demands of medieval kingship. He would rise before dawn for private prayers, then attend public mass with his court. The morning would be spent reviewing reports from his various administrators, receiving ambassadors, and making decisions about governmental business. The afternoon might include military training, hunting, which was both recreation and military exercise, or meetings with important nobles. Evenings at Richard's court were often elaborate affairs, featuring feasts that could last for hours, entertainment by musicians and storytellers, and political discussions that continued far into the night. Richard was known for his wit and his ability to dominate any gathering through the force of his personality. Visitors to his court often commented on his energy and charisma, describing how he could make everyone in a room feel that they had his complete attention. Richard's interests extended beyond warfare and politics to include architecture, engineering, and what we might now call technology. He was fascinated by castle design and siege engines, often working directly with his engineers to develop new approaches to fortification and assault. The famous Chateau Gaillard, which Richard built to defend Normandy, incorporated innovative features that influenced castle design throughout Europe. His personal possessions reflected both his royal status and his individual interests. Richard owned magnificent armor, including several suits designed specifically for different types of combat. His personal weapons were works of art, as well as tools of war, decorated with precious metals and inscribed with religious phrases. But he also owned books, musical instruments, and maps that revealed his intellectual curiosity and cultural sophistication. The final phase of Richard's life began with one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval history, his capture and imprisonment while returning from the Holy Land. In December 1192, Richard was traveling through Austria in disguise when he was recognized and arrested by Duke Leopold V, whom Richard had humiliated during the Crusade. This began a captivity that would last over a year and test every aspect of Richard's character and his kingdom's loyalty. Richard's imprisonment in Dürnstein Castle, high on a cliff overlooking the Danube River, became the stuff of legend. The castle was a forbidding fortress of gray stone, with walls 20 feet thick and windows barely large enough to let in light. Richard's cell was in the highest tower, accessible only by a narrow spiral staircase that could be easily defended. The room itself was small and cold, furnished only with a narrow bed, a wooden table, and a single chair. But even in captivity, Richard remained a king. He refused to let his imprisonment break his spirit or diminish his dignity. He established a routine that maintained both his physical and mental health. Each morning began with prayers and physical exercise. Richard would practice sword movements and do strengthening exercises to keep his body ready for combat. He spent hours each day composing poetry and music, creating some of his most famous works during this period of enforced leisure. The legend of Blondel, the faithful minstrel, who supposedly discovered Richard's location by singing outside various castles until he heard Richard's voice joining in their shared song, may be fictional, but it captures something true about Richard's character during his captivity. He never stopped being the larger-than-life figure who had dominated every situation he entered. Even his jailers came to respect and, in some cases, admire their famous prisoner. Meanwhile, back in England, the news of Richard's capture created a political crisis. His brother John immediately began plotting to seize the throne permanently, while Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s, took charge of raising the enormous ransom demanded for Richard's release. The sum was staggering: 150,000 marks of silver, equivalent to several years' income for the entire Kingdom of England. Eleanor's efforts to raise the ransom demonstrated both her political skill and her devotion to her son. She traveled throughout England and Richard's French territories, demanding contributions from every level of society. Churches were required to surrender their silver ornaments, nobles had to pay crushing taxes, and even peasants were asked to contribute whatever they could spare. The effort required unprecedented cooperation between different social classes and different regions of Richard's empire. The process of collecting and transporting such an enormous ransom was itself a massive undertaking. The silver had to be gathered, weighed, tested for purity, and then transported under heavy guard across hostile territory to Austria. Eleanor personally oversaw much of this process, demonstrating the administrative abilities that had made her one of the most effective rulers of her generation. Richard's release in February 1194 was celebrated throughout his territories, but he returned to find his kingdom changed by his long absence. John's rebellions had weakened royal authority in England, French forces had occupied parts of Normandy, and the enormous cost of the ransom had strained the kingdom's finances to the breaking point. Richard had to rebuild his power from a position of considerable weakness. But Richard's response to these challenges demonstrated the resilience and determination that had made him a great military leader. Instead of retreating to England to focus on domestic problems, he chose to launch an immediate campaign to recover his lost territories in France. This decision was controversial. Many of his advisors urged him to consolidate his position in England first, but it reflected Richard's understanding that his reputation and his kingdom's security depended on military success. The campaigns of Richard's final years showed him at his most brilliant as a military strategist and tactician. He had learned from his experiences during the Crusade and had developed new approaches to warfare that combined speed, flexibility, and devastating effectiveness. His army was smaller than it had been during his earlier campaigns, but it was also more professional and more experienced. The construction of Chateau Gaillard, Richard's great fortress, overlooking the Seine River, represented the culmination of his architectural and military genius. The castle incorporated everything Richard had learned about fortification during his years of warfare. Its design was revolutionary, featuring multiple lines of defense, innovative siege-resistant features, and a commanding position that controlled river traffic and overland routes. Richard personally supervised every aspect of the castle's construction, working with his engineers to solve technical problems and constantly refining the design as construction progressed. Contemporary chroniclers described how Richard would climb scaffolding to inspect work sites, discuss masonry techniques with stonemasons, and test defensive features by organizing mock assaults. The castle became Richard's obsession and his masterpiece, a physical embodiment of his strategic vision and his determination to hold his French territories. But even as Richard was achieving new military successes, his body was beginning to show the effects of decades of warfare, imprisonment, and constant stress. He was approaching 42, old for a medieval warrior, and the accumulated injuries from years of combat were taking their toll. He suffered from recurring fevers, probably contracted during the Crusade, and his joints ached from old wounds and the damp conditions of castle life. Richard's relationship with his wife Berengaria during these final years remained distant but respectful. She had established her own court in her dower lands, and they saw each other only occasionally during major court celebrations. The lack of children continued to be a source of concern for both personal and political reasons. Richard had acknowledged one illegitimate son, Philip of Cognac, but the succession remained uncertain. His relationship with his brother John had reached a state of armed truce. John's repeated betrayals during Richard's absence had destroyed any trust between them, but Richard still hoped to avoid an open break that would plunge the kingdom into civil war. Their meetings during this period were formal and tense, with both brothers surrounded by their supporters and careful to avoid giving any impression of weakness. Richard's final campaign began in March 1199 with a dispute over a treasure trove found on the lands of one of his vassals, Aymar of Limoges. The dispute itself was minor, exactly the sort of feudal disagreement that medieval rulers dealt with constantly. But Richard saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate his authority and perhaps acquire additional resources for his ongoing campaigns. The siege of the small castle of Châlus-Chabrol should have been a routine operation. The castle was neither particularly strong nor strategically important, and its garrison was small. Richard arrived with a modest force and expected the siege to last only a few days. On the evening of March 25, 1199, Richard was inspecting the siege works when a crossbow bolt fired from the castle walls struck him in the shoulder. At first, the wound didn't seem serious. Richard had been wounded many times before and had always recovered quickly. He joked with his companions about the poor marksmanship of the defender who had shot him, and he insisted on continuing to direct the siege operations. But when the castle surgeon attempted to remove the crossbow bolt, the point broke off, leaving fragments of metal deep in Richard's shoulder. Over the following days, infections set in, In an era before antibiotics, even minor wounds could prove fatal if they became infected, and Richard's wound was becoming increasingly serious. Fever developed, and the wound began to separate despite the efforts of the medical experts who were called to treat the king. Richard, experienced in the realities of medieval warfare, probably understood before anyone else that he was dying. Richard's behavior during his final days revealed the complexity of his character. He ordered that the castle be taken and most of its defenders executed, but he pardoned the crossbowman who had shot him, even giving him a small gift of money. He spent long hours in confession with his chaplains, seeking forgiveness for what he acknowledged as a life filled with violence and sin. He also worked to settle his political affairs, trying to ensure as smooth a succession as possible. The political discussions surrounding Richard's deathbed were intense and crucial for the future of his kingdoms. The succession was complicated by the lack of direct heirs and by competing claims from different branches of the family. Richard ultimately designated his brother John as his heir, despite their troubled relationship, because he believed John was the only candidate who could hold the Plantagenet Empire together. Richard died on April 6, 1199, 11 days after being wounded. His death was quiet and relatively peaceful, surrounded by his closest advisors and attended by clergy who had traveled from England to be with their king. Contemporary accounts describe how Richard faced death with the same courage he had shown in life, making his final confessions and giving his last instructions with calm dignity. The immediate aftermath of Richard's death revealed both the extent of his personal impact and the fragility of the political structures he had built. News of his death spread across Europe within days, carried by messengers who rode hard to reach every corner of his empire. The reaction was extraordinary. Churches held special services, nobles gathered to discuss the implications, and ordinary people who had never seen their king wept for his loss. Richard's body was prepared for burial according to royal custom, embalmed and dressed in his finest robes. His funeral became a statement about his identity and his priorities. His heart was buried at Rouen Cathedral in Normandy, his body at Fontevraud Abbey beside his father, and his entrails at Châlus where he had died. This division reflected the reality that Richard had been not just King of England, but ruler of territories across France that had been equally important to him. The funeral procession to Fontevraud was a magnificent spectacle that drew crowds from across the region. Richard's body was carried on a hearse decorated with his royal arms and surrounded by hundreds of knights carrying torches. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s and devastated by the loss of her favorite son, walked behind the hearse despite her age and grief. The abbey church was packed with nobles, clergy, and ordinary people who had come to pay their respects to the king they had called Lionheart. The news of Richard the Lionheart's death sent shockwaves throughout medieval Europe that would be felt for generations. When the messengers reached London with word that the king was dead, the city bells tolled continuously for 3 days, and markets and businesses closed as people gathered in churches and public squares to share their grief and anxiety about what would come next. In Paris, King Philip Augustus of France, Richard's former ally and later enemy, reportedly wept when he heard the news, despite their political conflicts. "The world has lost its greatest knight," Philip was quoted as saying, words that captured the respect Richard commanded even among his enemies. Throughout the courts of Europe, nobles who had fought alongside Richard, negotiated with him, or simply heard stories of his exploits, expressed genuine sorrow at his passing. The Muslim world also mourned Richard's death in its own way. Saladin had died 6 years earlier, but his successors and chroniclers recognized in Richard a worthy opponent whose death marked the end of an era. Muslim historians would later write that Richard had been the most formidable Christian leader they had ever faced, a man whose military genius had earned their respect even as they fought against him. The immediate political consequences of Richard's death were severe and long-lasting. The Plantagenet Empire, that had dominated Western Europe for 50 years, began to fragment almost immediately. John, Richard's successor, lacked his brother's military abilities and personal magnetism. Within 5 years of Richard's death, John had lost most of the family's French territories to Philip Augustus, including Normandy, which had been in the family for 3 centuries. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now the last survivor of her generation, and devastated by the loss of her favorite son, worked desperately to hold the empire together. Despite being nearly 80 years old, she traveled constantly between England and France, negotiating treaties, arranging marriages, and trying to maintain the complex web of alliances that Richard had built. But even her remarkable energy and political skill couldn't compensate for the fundamental weakness of John's position. The financial impact of Richard's reign continued to affect England for decades after his death. The enormous costs of the Third Crusade, the ransom paid for Richard's release, and the constant warfare of his final years had drained the royal treasury and imposed crushing tax burdens on his subjects. John inherited a kingdom that was essentially bankrupt, which contributed to the political crises that would eventually force him to sign the Magna Carta. But Richard's death also unleashed forces that would reshape medieval Europe in positive ways. The crisis of succession and the loss of the French territories forced the English nobility to focus more attention on England itself, leading to developments in law, administration, and representative government that would eventually make England one of the most advanced kingdoms in Europe. The Magna Carta, which limited royal power and established important legal principles, was a direct consequence of the political upheavals that followed Richard's death. Richard's military innovations and tactical insights influenced warfare throughout Europe for centuries. The siege techniques he developed during the Crusade were studied and copied by military engineers across the continent. His approach to cavalry warfare, which combined the shock power of heavy cavalry with the flexibility of lighter troops, became the standard model for medieval armies. Even his enemies adopted many of his innovations, spreading his influence far beyond the territories he had directly controlled. The architectural legacy of Richard's reign was equally significant. Chateau Gaillard, his masterpiece fortress in Normandy, influenced castle design throughout Europe. Its innovative defensive features, including concentric walls, overlapping fields of fire, and sophisticated gate defenses, were copied in castles from Scotland to the Holy Land. When Philip Augustus finally captured the castle in 1204, he reportedly said that he would have taken it even if its walls were made of iron. But he also studied its design carefully and incorporated many of its features into his own fortifications. Richard's cultural impact was perhaps even more profound than his military and political legacy. The troubadours and poets who had flourished at his court spread his fame throughout Europe, creating a body of literature that portrayed him as the ideal Christian knight. These stories, songs, and poems created the legend of Richard the Lionheart that would inspire countless later works of literature, from medieval romances to modern novels and films. The legend grew with each telling. Within a generation of his death, Richard had become a figure of almost mythical proportions. Stories circulated about his impossible strength, his perfect chivalry, and his unwavering devotion to the Christian faith. Many of these stories were exaggerated or entirely fictional, but they reflected the genuine impact that Richard's personality and achievements had made on his contemporaries. The development of the Robin Hood legend was closely connected to the memory of Richard's reign. The earliest Robin Hood stories portrayed the outlaw as a loyal supporter of the absent King Richard, fighting against the corrupt officials who had usurped royal authority during the king's absence on crusade. This connection between Richard and the Robin Hood legend helped cement his reputation as a just and heroic ruler. Even though the historical Richard had spent very little time in England and had shown limited interest in domestic affairs, Richard's impact on the relationship between Christianity and Islam was complex and lasting. His respectful treatment of Muslim prisoners during certain phases of the Crusade, his diplomatic negotiations with Saladin, and his appreciation for Islamic culture helped establish precedents for more civilized conduct during religious warfare. Later crusaders would often invoke Richard's example when they sought to justify more moderate policies toward Muslim populations. The crusading ideal itself was profoundly shaped by Richard's example. His participation in the Third Crusade helped establish the template for what a crusading king should be: personally brave, militarily competent, and genuinely motivated by religious conviction. Later monarchs who sought to enhance their reputations would often take crusading vows, and many explicitly compared themselves to Richard the Lionheart. Richard's influence on the development of chivalric ideals cannot be overstated. The code of chivalry that dominated European noble culture for centuries was based partly on real examples of knightly behavior, and Richard provided one of the most compelling of those examples. His personal courage, his skill at arms, his loyalty to his friends, and his devotion to his word became models that knights throughout Europe tried to emulate. The economic impact of Richard's reign extended far beyond the immediate costs of his military campaigns. The Third Crusade had opened new trade routes between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, creating commercial opportunities that would benefit European merchants for centuries. The techniques for raising and managing large amounts of money that had been developed to fund the crusade were adapted for other purposes, contributing to the gradual development of more sophisticated financial systems. Richard's legacy in England was particularly complex. Although he had spent little time in the kingdom and had shown more interest in his French territories, he was remembered as one of England's greatest kings. This paradox reflects the power of his legend and the way that later generations projected their own values and aspirations onto his memory. The image of Richard as the absent but rightful king became a powerful symbol in English political culture. The influence of Richard's reign on the development of the English legal system was largely indirect, but nonetheless significant. The administrative reforms that had been necessary to govern the kingdom during his long absences helped establish precedents for royal administration that would be built upon by later monarchs. The financial pressures created by his expensive campaigns forced the development of new methods for raising revenue and managing royal finances. Modern historians have taken a more critical view of Richard's reign, pointing out the enormous costs of his military campaigns, his neglect of domestic affairs, and the political instability that followed his death. But even critical historians acknowledge that Richard was one of the most remarkable figures of his age, a man whose personality and achievements left an indelible mark on the medieval world. The archaeological evidence of Richard's impact continues to be discovered. Excavations at sites associated with the Third Crusade have uncovered weapons, fortifications, and other artifacts that can be connected to Richard's campaigns. The study of medieval castle architecture reveals the continuing influence of the innovations he pioneered. Even DNA analysis has been used to study remains that may be connected to Richard's family, adding new dimensions to our understanding of his world. Richard's story has inspired countless works of art, literature, and popular culture over the 8 centuries since his death. From medieval chronicles to Hollywood movies, from Renaissance paintings to modern novels, the figure of Richard the Lionheart has captured imaginations and provided inspiration for creators across all media. This continuing cultural influence is perhaps the most lasting aspect of his legacy. The debate over Richard's true character and the value of his achievements continues among historians, but there is no debate about his historical significance. Whether viewed as a heroic crusader king or as a military adventurer who neglected his royal responsibilities, Richard the Lionheart was undeniably one of the most influential figures of the medieval period, a man whose life and death helped shape the course of European history. And that's the story of Richard the Lionheart. From 1157 to 1199, he lived a life full of adventure, courage, and remarkable achievements that few people in any age could match. In just 41 years, he became one of the most famous and influential people in medieval Europe, a man whose name is still remembered and respected more than 800 years later. Richard was many things. A warrior who never lost a battle, a king who inspired fierce loyalty, a poet who composed beautiful songs, and a leader who could make ordinary soldiers believe they were capable of extraordinary things. He was also a man with flaws and contradictions, someone who could be generous and cruel, wise and impulsive, deeply religious and ruthlessly practical, all at the same time. What made Richard truly special wasn't just his military genius or his royal birth, but his ability to live life at full intensity. Whether he was leading a cavalry charge, composing a poem, building a castle, or negotiating with enemies, Richard threw himself completely into whatever he was doing. He never did anything halfway, never held back, out of caution or fear. His story reminds us that even in an age very different from our own, individual courage and determination could change the course of history. Richard showed that one person with vision, skill, and absolute commitment could influence the lives of millions of people and leave a legacy that would endure for centuries. As you drift off to sleep, you might think about the boy who was born in Oxford on that September day in 1157, who grew up in the castles and courts of medieval Europe, who learned to be a warrior and a king, who traveled to the Holy Land to fight for his faith, and who died defending a small castle in France, still fighting, still believing in the causes that had driven him throughout his remarkable life. Richard the Lionheart lived in a world of stone castles and great adventures, of noble quests and epic battles, but most of all, he lived in a world where honor, courage, and loyalty still mattered above everything else. His story ended more than 8 centuries ago, but the example he set of living life boldly, of standing up for what you believe in, and of never giving up in the face of overwhelming odds remains as inspiring today as it was in his own time. Rest well, knowing that some stories, like Richard's, are too powerful and too beautiful to ever be forgotten.